Now we'll move to the practice session. Now for k-means clustering, we are basically using this scikit-learn sklearn library, and this library pandas we have seen, this is for loading data from external file, and matplotlib library is for visualization purpose. NumPy helps us in doing various kind of calculations, and in sklearn first we are importing this standard scalar. This is required to standardize the variables, because different variables might be measured in different unit, and that might create a problem in the distance calculation, in the sense if you change the unit, the distance will be different, so that is not desirable. So we need to standardize the variable unless variables are measured in the same scale. And then from sklearn we are importing k-means, and from sklearn decomposition we are importing, this is principal component analysis. We have discussed the role of principal component in deciding the number of cluster, and we are also importing the CLUT score. This is also a metric we are going to use in deciding the number of cluster. Now let's first run these libraries, and once you run these libraries, then you can move to the loading the data. So this is the data. We will give a description of this data. So we are loading this data. In this data is the different states of USA, and there are 4 attributes or features. This is the number of murder arrests per 1 million population, and this is also number of assault arrests. This is what percentage of the populations are living in the urban area, and this is the number of rape arrests. So these are the 4 variables. Now we can look at the shape, that means how many number of rows and columns we have. So we have 50 rows, that means data is there for 50 different states, and you can see there are 5 columns. Now for clustering purpose, we'll pick up this part of the data, leaving aside that string column. So this is what I am doing, starting from the column index 1, that means column index 0 is excluded. So after excluding this, the data becomes like this. And then we are standardizing this variable. The concept of standardization is, from each variable you subtract its mean and you divide by the standard deviation of this variable. So after standardization, the variable mean, each variable mean shifts to 0 and the variance becomes 1. So now all the variables are at par. So this is the step for standardizing this variable. So these are the standardized value of those 4 variables. Now we do not know what is the appropriate number of cluster, that means into how many groups these states can be divided. So initially I just start with 2 cluster, and you see this is an arbitrary choice, but nevertheless we start with 2, and later on we'll see using our guidelines. Notice the number of initiation. So we are starting with 20 random initiation of cluster centroid, and finally it will choose that clustering for which the cost function will be minimum. So I just run this cell, and then we can look at which observation has gone to which cluster. So cluster level, like observation 1 and observation 2 are in the same cluster, and observation 3 also in the same cluster, but fourth observation is in a different cluster. And you see last observations and fourth observations, they are in the same cluster. And we can also look at the cluster size. So from NumPy library we are using this unique function, and we are putting this level here. So and this argument, second argument return counts, will give you the frequency. That frequency, that means the frequency of 1 and frequency of 0. So that will give you the cluster size. So frequency of 0 is 30 and 1 is 20. That means in one cluster you have 30 observations, and other cluster you have 20 observations. Now this level which we have just calculated here, that I am adding as a new column in my original data, and then I am using from pandas group by command, I am grouping the data by this level column and then calculating mean of each variable. So that is giving me the final centroid of this two cluster. And you see this, if you just choose this array of number, that first row, so this is a vector, this is a vector of feature means, and this vector of feature mean is the centroid. So if you just compare this centroid, you can see in one group all the states have fallen where the murder arrest is quite high, and assault arrest is also quite high, rape arrest is also quite high. That means in this group it is something like red zone states where crime is very high, whereas in zero cluster, whichever states are there, crime rate is relatively low compared to cluster 1. Now question comes deciding about an appropriate number of cluster. So what I have done here, I have calculated this silhouette score as well as this total within group sum of square is the k-means cost function. So and these are, first we have created two empty list, and we have taken k value starting from number 2 and it will go up to 10. That means for k value 2 cluster to 10 cluster, we have calculated the silhouette score as well as the k-means cost value, and we have run a loop for this k value will change. From first it will take 2, then 3, then it will move up to 10, and for each k value after fitting the cluster we have calculated what is the level given, and then we calculated the average silhouette score, and this cluster inertia in sklearn, this is the, it calculates the total within cluster variation. So I run this cell. So after you run this cell, now this empty list, you have value of k-means cost function for k value 2 to 10, and then we are drawing a line plot. In x-axis is the k value and y-axis is the value of k-means cost function, and we can look at this graph and see where the elbow is occurring. So elbow is occurring around 4. So this gives some RAP guidelines what should be the appropriate number of cluster. But we say it's a RAP guideline because you might find that between this 3, 4 and 5, perhaps 3 is giving more actionable and more interpretable solution in terms of the problem. It may be a policy kind of problem. You take some corrective measures to decrease the crime rate or anything else. Now this is one sort of guideline. Then we can look at the second guidelines, and it is not necessary that all the metrics will point to the same number. It gives some rough guidelines. So in the second case, we are plotting the k value in the x-axis and the average silhouette score of all observations for a particular k value. And we can see, although the silhouette score at value 2 is the highest, but at 0.4 it gives a peak. It goes down at 3, but at 0.4 it is giving the peak value, and other values that silhouette score are less. So this is also suggesting around 4 cluster. And a third sort of guidelines, you plot the original data. The original data is 4-dimensional. You have seen the data that the all states, there are 4 attributes, 4 features, and here you want to project the data into 2 lower dimensional, that is called principal component, and then you try to look at the data. So looking at the data, it is not very clear into how many cluster the states can be divided. However, other guidelines are giving us some idea about the k value. So based on the other criteria, for example, this criteria of elbow criteria, I am choosing value of k equal to 4. And then what we are doing, we are fitting 4 cluster, and I have changed the initiation, that is varying between 10 to 20 initiation. 10 is the perhaps the default setting, so I just fit 4 cluster, and then we look at the levels. So you see there are 4 levels, 0, 1, 2, 3, there are 4 levels, and then this level I am adding as a new column in the principal component data frame I have created. And then we can look at the plot of principal component, but this time this column I am passing as a color argument. So this will show the original data, how it is doing clustering on a principal component plot. So if you look, so these observations, they are one cluster, and this purple, this is one cluster, and green is one cluster, and this is another cluster. So this way it is dividing the states into cluster. And we can look at the cluster centroid. For finding cluster centroid, the level we have calculated, that one we are adding as a new variable in the original data, and then we are grouping by this categorical column. And you can see from the result, this cluster 1, this is very high in terms of crime, and next highest is this column, whereas whichever state which has fallen into this cluster, this is having the least crime, and this is something in between. Now we can have a look about which states have fallen into which cluster. So here I am just choosing entire data frame. I have divided based on this clustering, and we can look at the which states. These are not cities, these are the states. Which states have fallen into cluster 0. So these are the states which have fallen into cluster 0, and you see cluster 0 is also high crime rate. So these states have high crime rate, and cluster 1 is also having very high crime rate. So which states are falling in cluster 1? So we can look at that. The states falling in cluster 1, this is the red zone states, so they have very high crime rate. And these two states, they have relatively less crime. So we can also look at which states are falling in this cluster. So if you look at the cluster mean, cluster 3 is the lowest crime rate. So we can look at the states. So these states are having low crime rate, as well as this state is having the lowest crime rate. So from the point of view of crime, these states are the safest states. So this is one cluster, and we can also look at the cluster size. It is the same type of code I have used, so I am not going to explain the code part once again, but we can look at the cluster size. So in one cluster there are 8 states, other cluster 13 states, and so on. And we can also look at the this states along with this state's name in a principal component plot. For that, this one will give you the principal component plot, but along with that I have added the state's name, which you can do this way, and we can look at the plot. It is showing the same thing, that these are the states in one cluster and these states are in another cluster. So these are the 4 cluster, and we have also given a description of this cluster. Now finally it depends, if it is a policy point of view, whether dividing the states into 4 cluster will make more sense, or 3 cluster, like one cluster which is red zone state, which is having the highest crime rate, and something of yellow zone states which are having the next crime rate, and finally green zone states which is having the lowest crime rate. So the final clustering number will depend on which is the most not only interpretable but actionable from clustering point of view.